Man's discovery inside a storage unit prompts police to arrive sooner than he expected. Life is basically one surprise after another. None of us know what event's waiting to happen, who we're going to meet, or a secret we would get to uncover. There's so many things surrounding us. Some we pay attention to, some we don't. This man by chance discovered a hidden storage unit that had something inside that eventually got the police involved. Such a dream. So what exactly did this man find? Well, anyone would be happy to discover something precious, be it by mistake or intentionally, right? Well, placing the final bid and ending up winning the contents that are inside a storage container would definitely be something to be happy about. This could surely be a dream come true or a nightmare from hell. Not ready for the police. We rarely know what the future holds. What's going to happen to us even 5 minutes from now? So when this guy uncovers the real contents that lay inside his container, he was dumbstruck. In fact, he was in such a state of shock as soon as he opened to see what was inside. To make matters worse, he wasn't ready for the police, who arrived shortly. A bidding game. You see, this guy was someone who liked to steer away from safe and boring activities. He loved to bid on storage units because he always knew that there'd be something worth bidding for on inside. The more he did it, the more he became even more comfortable about bidding on storage containers at the auction site. Since he was not a wealthy man, the stakes were high, and this was indeed a huge gamble. He had absolutely no means of knowing what was inside these storage units, but since he had heard so many stories about how people have made it rich from these storage units, in fact, there had been talks of people finding classic cars and riding into the sunset. Problem-free for now. And since he liked the thrill of the mystery and suspense, this man became a regular at the auction. He'd frequently bid on these storage units in the hopes that something precious or valuable would come along. And as of now, there'd been very little issues. He was always lucky. He would go on to sell what was in the units with a price slightly higher than what he bought them for. A lot of work. However, though bidding on these storage units may seem like a fun activity, it's actually not. You have to go through a lot of work and invest quite a long time, since you would have to go through somebody else's junk. Then comes the sorting, washing, and then getting the right buyer. He soon became a little bored of this. He told himself this would be his last bidding. Oh, so crowded. So Joe was there, standing with the crowd who had come there for the same reason as him. Joe was standing outside the container, and there were around 15 to 20 other people. All these people had come there, eager to rummage what had been kept inside the 5x15 unit, 75 square foot. They all wanted to find something worth their time and effort. Joe wanted to make sure he found something worthwhile in this raid, but since this storage unit was equivalent to that of a one-bedroom apartment, it would be foolish to be too slow and look around. There were dining table sets, couches, and some business merchandises. The place was certainly not worth spending hundreds of dollars on. So when it came time to bid, it was actually a fun time. The bidding was, however, not like they're shown on TV. There's always dramatic screaming, shoving other people, people shouting, and just mayhem all around. However, there's no doubt about the fun they are. There's extra fun when a bidding war happens with somebody else too. So since this was, after all, a bidding war, it was always a pleasure to win. Joe was sure to, however, warn himself not to get carried away. This was not the first time, so he promised himself that he would, by all means, stick to the budget he'd set. Since he knew he could not afford to lose, Joe did not want to risk all he had for a loss. He needed to play smart. Getting carried away. Though Joe was not a newbie to this bidding war, he still had a hard time finding the balance. He told himself to stick to his budget, but for this bid he could not control himself for some reason. The container was full of furniture and other items he needed to take a closer inspection at. There was also another woman who was upping every bid of his. A heated bidding. And so the bidding started at $100. This was indeed a high starting bid, but since this particular container was full of objects and items, no one could tell what might exist there. He began bidding, then the woman raised the bet a little, to which he bet again. This was continued for some time. The bidding war was heated, and no one knew how long it would continue. Never ending. So the bidding got to a high price, and before Joe realized it, it had actually increased $350, which was well over his budget. But since he didn't want to give up, he did whatever he could to be the winner. And even at $400, the lady behind him was still not giving up. The bidding then went to $450, $460, $470. Finally, at $500, the bid ended. Snapping back. Since the bidding went up so high, Joe felt shattered and shaken up. He'd been so caught up in the whole bidding war that he'd forgotten about the promise he made to himself. By the time he came back to reality, the damage had been done, and Joe realized what had happened. Having said that, Joe won the bid and he prayed something good was inside. What treasure? So since this became a war between Joe and the lady, most of the people present there had vanished. Everyone except a handful of people had disappeared from the site now. Since Joe had won the bid, they'd thrown in the towel and vamoosed from the area. Their interest was lost after realizing they would not be winning this time. Waiting for Joe. And so after most of the bidders had left its storage unit, only a few stayed back. The ones who were still around were watching the new owner enter the small building. They were still curious to find out what was hidden inside after they witnessed Joe and the lady fight over it. Then, after they saw what was lying there all along, everyone grew jealous. Worth it all? And so, as these people waited for Joe to make his entry, he finally did. And as he slowly went inside the 5x15 unit, no one could predict what was to be found there. There was a lot of old furniture that had been kept inside the storage unit, but there was a small gap of space between for him to walk around to check these items. Looking around. As he glanced through the storage unit, Joe could actually feel the sweat streaming down the back of his neck. His forehead was full of sweat, and even all the furniture found inside could not have been able to pay off the high price he'd given for the unit. There needed to be something worth all the money spent, so Joe continued looking for something. There was a safe. And so Joe inspected the unit closely. His eyes caught hold of something interesting. They quickly fell towards a dull gray container, which laid on the floor beside the chest of drawers. When Joe saw this, he quickly wanted to get it open. He was getting curious by the minute, but since the safe was locked up, he had to wait and get something to open it with. Open it up. When the safe could not be opened so easily, Joe had to resort to something else. He ended up calling a friend of his to get there and bring a drill with him. As time went on, Joe became all the more curious to see what was hiding from him inside the safe. He had a few assumptions, but never in a million years did he believe that this safe would be filled with secrets. Breaking the lock. As soon as Joe's friend reached, he brought the drill with him. Since Joe could hardly wait, he quickly got into action. Joe then drilled deeply into the lock that had been keeping the items inside safe. Since there was no key, they obviously had to forcefully open it up. He had to intently drill the lock to make sure the insides were not damaged. Tapes and a note. So when the safe finally opened, Joe was shocked. It would have been surprising for anyone to see what was kept inside. There was a collection of old VHS tapes. And then Joe quickly got up and pulled these tapes out of the safe. There was a mysterious note placed under the tapes. So what was the note about and what was it doing there? Such a mystery. The note was such a mystery, it gave Joe shivers and chills ran down his spine because of what was written on the note. Well, it simply said, "Don't," in very untidy handwriting. Joe then started looking through the old videotapes. He could see that some of the tapes had been dated. However, there was no other info to keep on them. Feeling watched. Joe got a little scared after investigating the tapes that had been kept inside the locked-up safe. A strange feeling crept up on him. He felt like someone was watching his every move after reading the cryptic note placed in the safe. He looked around but could see that he was the only person in the storage container. Something was off. Joe was anxious. Investigation. And yes, for Joe and his extraordinary discovery, things were not about to run so smooth. After just about 2 hours, Joe heard a knocking coming from the door. Men with uniforms then started inspecting the whole container. Joe was certainly not happy for long. Had he gotten himself into trouble? There was yet another interesting incident waiting to happen. So much going on. The safe he found had been stacked with yellowed wax paper. Joe then went ahead and unwrapped this bundle to discover $50 bills. Then parcel after parcel. Joe went on to unwrap a lot more. Joe had never come across such a huge sum of money. So what was the total amount of money he'd found there? Whose money was this? How had the police joined in? The evidence. Joe then realized that the photos he'd sent his girlfriend when he initially got so excited had ended up on several social media sites. This was probably why the police had arrived. He was unable to count just how much money was, but he could tell it was a lot. It might have been a total of $1 million. He then approached the police, who had come. There was someone else who was interested. Dirty money. So after taking the time to count the total amount of money, Joe realized that there was a total of $7.5 million kept in different safes across the containers. There were nickel and $100 bills and even pink slips for cars. The biggest problem, however, was the fact that the original owner got word of this. He then hired a top-notch lawyer to reclaim his fortune. A few questions. When word got around that Joe actually had discovered so much money, it took a frightening turn. He received so many threats. What seemed like such a blessing soon turned into a living nightmare for Joe. When he laid in bed that night, Joe wondered why there was so much money in the storage containers and why it took so long for someone to claim it. Receiving threats. The pace picked up rather quickly by the time the police had arrived, and soon after there was a call for Joe. The lawyers of the owner had called him to let him know that he could keep $600,000 since he found the money. Joe had to make a decision really quick. He could not tell if the original owner of the safe was someone to be messed with. Under the law. So after taking some time to think, Joe asked one of his friends for some advice. Joe then got to know that once the storage unit is sold, the items do not belong to the delinquent tenant anymore. Joe was actually the rightful owner, and he could keep anything he wanted. He'd bought this legally. However, the lawyers were not easy to shoo away either. How bad would it get? And so they changed their offer to somehow do Joe a service, upping their finder's fee to $1.2 million. The lawyers wanted to play hardball. There was no telling what the original owners and his lawyers were capable of. How could anyone forget a whopping $7.5 million in a storage rental of all places? He could not have been a good person, right? Having to return it. Was it fair for Joe to only receive $1.2 million? Now, though this was indeed a huge sum of money for anyone, it was a measly amount as compared to the total money found. He was happy about having to choose. He didn't like the fact that he was given an ultimatum. However, although Joe found this, he did not earn it. He was unsure about the situation. Settling on a deal. So after Joe had to deal with all the threats and confusion, he made a decision that he thought would be the fairest split. He wanted to get half the amount. Since the original owner did not answer the letters sent by the storage owners, leaving the money there for so long, Joe felt like this was wrong. So when the auction had taken place, it was right of him to get the money. No loss? The storage owner revealed, "I really don't make much money out of auctions. It's to try to cover our expenses. 90% of the time I don't cover my losses. One unit may have cost me $600 and the person bids at $400, so my revenue still suffered a loss." Adding, "An unpaid unit does not make any money. The sooner the delinquent tenant can be moved out, the sooner a paying tenant can move in."